Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 27, the Reproductive System in NURS 1020 Anatomy and Physiology 2. In today's lesson, we'll be going over and discussing the anatomy of the male and female reproductive system. In terms of the physiology, we'll be focusing upon the menstrual cycle for female reproductive physiology, and then we'll also briefly review the male reproductive physiology. Please remember to read Chapter 27 while always referring to the learning outcomes in the syllabus. The reproductive system is divided into the primary and secondary sexual organs. The primary sex organs, or gonads, are the testes and the ovaries. They produce the gametes, which are the sex cells, the sperm and the ova. The testes and the ovaries also secrete various sex hormones, which are steroid-based. They include the androgens, which are the male sex hormones, and estrogen and progesterone, which are the female sex hormones. The sex hormones play a role in the growth and development of the reproductive organs, the primary and secondary reproductive organs, as well as the growth and development of many other organs and tissues. We'll be describing the effects of testosterone and estrogen a bit later on. The accessory or secondary reproductive organs include all the ducts, glands, and the external genitalia in both the male and female reproductive systems. We'll start off by looking at the anatomy of the male reproductive system, and we'll begin with the testes that's located in the scrotum outside of the male body. It has to be located outside of the male body because spermatogenesis occurs best at a lower temperature than core body temperature, which is 37 degrees Celsius. So sperm is produced by the seminiferous tubules in the testes, not shown here, and then it will be transported to the epididymis and then ultimately into the vas deferens. All that is the vas deferens. The vas deferens ultimately joins up with the ejaculatory duct, and the fluid from the seminal vesicles over here that produces the bulk of semen will also empty into the ejaculatory duct and join up with the urethra. The urethra consists of several parts coming off the bladder. Initially, the prostatic urethra goes through the prostate, and the function of the prostate, as we'll see, is also to produce some nutrients and nourishments that ultimately goes into the semen and helps to nourish the sperm before fertilization occurs. Same thing with the fluid from the seminal vesicles and also the fluid from the bulbourethral glands. Just going back to the urethra, we have the prostatic urethra, and the prostate also serves to help to propel the sperm out during ejaculation. So the prostate, it has smooth muscle, and when it contracts, it pushes or propels the sperm and the semen out through the rest of the urethra during ejaculation. So the urethra has a prostatic part, and then the urethra enters into the penis. We'll talk about the structure of the penis a bit later on, but we'll see the penis has three parts to it: the corpus spongiosum, through which the spongy urethra travels through, and then the corpus cavernosum, that is the erectile tissue. It can expand greatly in order to enable erection to occur. It'll be filled with blood in its various sinuses, pockets over here. So that's the main erectile tissue of the penis and its ped. We're only seeing one over here because this is the sagittal view. And that's pretty much it for the anatomy of the male reproductive system. We'll look at the structure of the testes in more detail, including the seminiferous tubules, the epididymis, and the vas deferens. Actually, we'll do that right now. So here's the anatomy of the testes. You can see the seminiferous tubules over here where spermatogenesis occurs, and then it empties into the epididymis. The epididymis is divided into several parts: the head, the body, and then the tail of the epididymis, which will become continuous with the ductus deferens or the vas deferens here. The vas deferens or the ductus deferens will then join up with the rest of the spermatic cord, and the spermatic cord is made up of the vas deferens or ductus deferens along with the testicular arteries and veins. That will go into the inguinal canal and then join up with the prostatic urethra, as we saw earlier. Just to summarize, the seminiferous tubules of the testes produce the sperm. We're not going to go through all the steps, but sperm will then be delivered to the exterior through a system of ducts, which includes the epididymis, then onto the ductus deferens, into the ejaculatory duct. And remember, we have secretions from the seminal vesicles coming through the ejaculatory duct as well, which makes up the bulk of the semen, and then some secretions from the prostate itself and some from the bulbourethral glands. All that will be ultimately delivered into the urethra. Just to reiterate, the seminal vesicles produce the fluid that make up the bulk of the semen and serves to nourish the sperm until fertilization occurs, kind of similar with the prostate as well, but the prostate also has a separate function of contracting and propelling the semen during ejaculation. And lastly, the corpus glands, or the bulbourethral glands, also produce some pre-ejaculatory fluid. Let's move on to discuss very briefly the anatomy of the penis. The root of the penis starts off higher up in the pelvis, and the shaft ends in the gland penis. There's the prepuce, or the foreskin, that covers the gland penis, and we also have the cura, which is the proximal ends of the corpus cavernosum that is surrounded by several muscles. Perhaps there's a bit too much detail about the ischiocavernosus muscle, but essentially the cura is what anchors the penis to the pubic arch. In the penis itself, we have the three cylindrical bodies of erectile tissue, the corpus spongiosum that surrounds the urethra and expands to form the gland penis at the distal end, and the corpus cavernosa, which are the paired posterior erectile tissue cylinders that, when filled with blood, enables an erection to occur. Let's now discuss the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal, or in this case testicular axis. This particular axis is really a sequence of hormonal regulatory events that involves the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, and the testes. It regulates the production of the gametes and the sex hormones through three interacting sets of hormones, including GnRH, or gonadotropic releasing hormones, which in turn triggers the release of LH and SHAs from the anterior pituitary. GnRH is released by the hypothalamus. LH and FSH, LH stands for luteinizing hormone and FSH for follicular stimulating hormone, then directly stimulate the testes to produce testosterone and inhibin. Testosterone and inhibin then have a negative feedback effect on both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Schematically, this is what it looks like. The hypothalamus releases GnRH that stimulates the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. GnRH travels down the hypophyseal portal tract to stimulate the specialized cells in the anterior pituitary to release LH and FSH. FSH triggers the release of this ABP protein, which is really not very important, from the Sertoli cells. More importantly, the Sertoli cells release inhibin that has a negative feedback effect on the anterior pituitary. LH, on the other hand, influences the Leydig, or the interstitial cells in the testes to produce testosterone. Testosterone also has a negative feedback effect on both the hypothalamus as well as on the anterior pituitary gland. Let's discuss the effects of testosterone now. Testosterone is synthesized from cholesterol, and it is the main hormone that initiates spermatogenesis at puberty. Testosterone, in fact, targets all the primary and secondary male sexual organs. These are its effects. It promotes the growth and development of the male sexual organs, including the testes, during the growth stage as well as during puberty. In fact, it is really testosterone that ultimately causes the fetus to develop the male sexual phenotype. Otherwise, by default, the fetus will develop the female sexual organs. Testosterone at puberty also triggers the appearance of pubic, axillary, as well as facial and body hair. The larynx and the deepening of the voice also occurs in response to an increase in the concentration of testosterone during puberty. Same thing with bone growth and an increase in bone density. Skeletal muscle growth is also stimulated by testosterone, and testosterone also boosts the basal metabolic rate and enhances the sex drives in males. Here, the development of the male sexual characteristics. We're going to look on the left side of here: an increase in the size of the larynx and the deepening of the voice, increased muscular development, growth of facial, axillary, and pubic hair, as well as enhanced growth of overall body hair. We'll look at the female sexual characteristics, secondary sexual characteristics later on. Here's it schematically what we've been discussing previously in terms of testosterone release. Remember, GnRH is released by the hypothalamus. It travels down the portal tract, hypophyseal portal tract, to the anterior pituitary, and then it triggers the release of LH and FSH. That has its effect on the testes, as we saw, triggering the release of testosterone. Testosterone then promotes spermatogenesis in the seminiferous tubules, as well as the development of male secondary sexual characteristics, as we saw previously. We'll then move on to female reproductive physiology, but the effects are pretty much the same in terms of the hypothalamus and pituitary gonadal axis, except the gonads are no longer the testes, they are the ovaries. But the first two steps are essentially the same. GnRH is released by the hypothalamus, travels down the hypophyseal portal tract to the anterior pituitary, triggering the release of LH and FSH, and then we'll see the effects of LH and FSH on the ovaries. Essentially, what LH and FSH do is that it also triggers the release of estrogen instead of testosterone, and estrogen has the effect of promoting the generation of the follicles. We'll see that when we discuss the ovarian and menstrual cycle, as well as the development of female secondary sexual characteristics, including the development and maturation of the breasts, the broadening of the hips, the pubic and axillary hair growth. Let's first start off by discussing the anatomy of the female reproductive system, which is very different, obviously, than the male reproductive system. So here's it in a lateral or sagittal view. The primary female reproductive organ are the ovaries that are just visible over here, but the view of the ovaries is better seen in the anterior view rather than the sagittal view, but the ovaries are here. Other organ systems in the female reproductive system includes the uterus. We'll look at the different parts of the uterus, including the fundus, the body, and the cervix. And then we have the vagina and the external female genitalia that we'll be looking at. On the anterior view, you can see over here, we have the uterus and all its various associated ligaments. We'll be discussing the anatomy when we label the diagrams and also watching some cadaver videos. But here's the ovaries. The ovum is released by the ovaries, and we'll look at that process. And then it travels up the uterine tubes that were previously called the fallopian tubes in order to enter into the uterus. Fertilization, if there's sperm here, typically occurs in the uterine tubes, and then the fertilized ovum will reach the uterus where it gets implanted in the endometrium. So we'll look at the structure of the uterus in more detail later on. Here's the vagina. Its proximal end is the cervix. Really, the cervix is the distal part of the uterus, or the inferior part of the uterus, and the vagina continues past the cervix. And then we have the external female genitalia that we'll also look at later on. Just in terms of the orientation of the uterus with respect to the other organs in the abdominal and pelvic cavity, we have the bladder that is anterior to the uterus, and then we have the rectum that is posterior to the uterus. The ovaries are the female gonads, and they produce the female gametes, which are the ova. The ovaries also secrete the female sex hormones, including estrogen, and estrogen is actually not a single substance. It's made up of several different hormones, which are just lumped together under the term estrogen. So more appropriately, it should be called estrogens, because estrogen is made up of estradiol, that's the main estrogen, but also estrone and estriol and so forth. So when we say estrogen, we are referring to all of them, although estradiol makes up the bulk of estrogen. The female sex hormones include estrogen and progesterone, and we'll see how they are secreted a bit later on. The accessory organs and ducts include the uterine tubes that we spoke of. They receive the oocyte from the ovaries and are the usual site of fertilization. The uterus, which is the site of implantation of the fertilized ovum, if that occurs, and the development of the fetus and the placenta also occurs here. In other words, it sustains the pregnancy. The vagina is a muscular tube that extends down from the cervix to the vaginal vestibule. It's also referred to as the birth canal and is the organ of copulation as well during sexual intercourse. Here's the schematic diagram of the female reproductive system in a little bit more detail. So you can see the ovaries over here held together by the ovarian ligament. When the ovary during the ovarian cycle releases the oocyte, it is captured by the fimbriae of the uterine tubes. The ovum then travels into the uterine tube, where if sperm is present, that's usually the site of fertilization. And if it is fertilized, the ovum, then the fertilized ovum will then get implanted into the thickened endometrium. We'll look, as I said, and discuss the ovarian and menstrual cycles in great detail, but it'll get implanted into the thickened endometrium in the uterus, which will then sustain the pregnancy. The distal part of the uterus, so the inferior part of the uterus, we can see is the cervix over here. So the three parts are the fundus, the body of the uterus, and the cervix. And then the vagina extends from the cervix. It's the muscular tube, the birth canal, or the and the organ of copulation. Let's discuss the uterus in a little bit more detail. As mentioned several times already, it is a muscular organ that receives, retains, and nourishes the fertilized ovum. The regions of the uterus include the fundus, which is the rounded superior region, the body, which is the bulk of the uterus, and the cervix, which is the narrowed inferior region that projects into the vagina. The cervix communicates with the vagina via the external os, and it communicates with the rest of the uterine body via the internal os. The cervical glands ultimately secrete mucus that blocks the sperm entry except during, that's the cervical mucus plug, so that usually blocks sperm entry except during the middle part of the ovarian and menstrual cycle when ovulation occurs and you want the sperm, if you do want that, to fertilize the ovum. This is when the cervical mucus plug will thin. The uterine wall is composed of three distinct layers: the endometrium, which is the innermost mucosal layer, and the endometrial layer or endometrium changes in response to the female reproductive hormones, being estrogen and progesterone. The endometrium, for example, thickens in anticipation of receiving and implanting the fertilized ovum, and we'll see what ultimately causes that, which of the two hormones, estrogen or progesterone. And the endometrium then sheds itself when implantation does not occur. In other words, menstruation begins. And we'll see what also triggers that. The myometrium is the middle part of the uterus, and it consists of the smooth muscle. And lastly, we have the perimetrium, which is the outer serous layer, and it's actually really just part of the visceral peritoneum. So the visceral peritoneum covers the uterus, and we refer to it as the perimetrium. Let's briefly discuss the external female genitalia. The external female genitalia is made up of several structures: the mons pubic, which is the fatty area overlying the pubis symphysis, the labia majora, which is the hair-covered fatty skin folds, the labia minora, which are the skin folds lying within the labia majora, the vestibule, which is the recess within the labia minora, usually referred to as the vaginal vestibule, the clitoris, which is analogous to the penis, that is anterior to the vestibule, and the clitoris has the glands of the clitoris, that is the exposed portion of the clitoris, that would be analogous to the glans penis, and the prepuce of the clitoris, which hoods the gland itself. The bulk of the clitoris, however, is not visible externally, it's embedded internally. The perineum is the diamond-shaped region between the pubic arch and the coccyx and is bordered by the ischiotuberosities laterally. Here's it schematically. Here's the glans clitoris. As I said, the bulk of the clitoris is not visible, only that's visible, the glands of the clitoris, and the prepuce that hoods the clitoris, analogous to the prepuce of the penis that covers the glans penis in uncircumcised individuals. The labia majora, which is the fatty folds, the labia minora, which is the skin folds within the labia majora, and then here we have the vaginal opening, and all this would be the vaginal vestibule. And we also have, lastly, the urethral opening. Here's the urethral opening, or external urethral meatus. Let's move on to discuss the breast or the mammary glands. Breast itself is composed mainly of fat, but it also consists of fibrous and endocrine tissue. You might have heard of the term the denser breast, especially in the context of mammography that is more difficult in denser breasts. When we say denser breast, it means that the breast has more fibrous and endocrine tissue as opposed to fatty tissue. The mammary glands that produce the milk are modified sweat glands consisting of 15 to 25 lobes. Under certain circumstances, during lactation, the mammary glands will produce milk, and we'll see this course is not focused on pregnancy and post-pregnancy lactation, but we'll see which hormones are involved in milk production once the baby is born. The areola is the pigmented skin surrounding the nipple itself, and the suspensory ligaments are what attach the breast to the underlying muscle, the pectoralis muscle. Lastly, we have the lobules within the lobes that contain the glandular alveoli. So this is not the alveoli in the respiratory system. The alveoli are really what produces the milk that these are the modified sweat glands. Here's it schematically. So you can see the mammary glands over here, which are really the lobules that contain the alveoli. When milk is produced, it goes through the lactiferous ducts. About 15, 20, 25 of these ducts empty into the areola and then expelled when the infant is nursing. Lastly, in terms of female reproductive physiology, we have to discuss both the ovarian and menstrual cycles. Let's start off with the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is a monthly series of events associated with the maturation of the egg, the female gamete. It has two consecutive phases, the follicular phase, which is the period of follicle growth, and that is days 1 to 14, and the follicular phase is the phase that varies. At the end of the follicular phase, ovulation occurs, which is the rupture of the follicle, thereby releasing the secondary oocyte into the uterine tubes. That occurs mid-cycle. And then we have the luteal phase, which is a period of corpus luteum activity. That's days 14 to 28. The luteal phase, unlike the follicular phase, is constant. It is a fixed 14 days from ovulation to the start of menstruation. Since the follicular phase varies, the overall length of the cycle therefore varies as well. Let's discuss the luteal phase in more detail. The follicular phase, remember, is simply the maturation of the follicle, and ultimately the follicle will rupture, releasing the oocyte. In the luteal phase, the ruptured follicle collapses. The granulosa cells in the internal thecal cells form ultimately the corpus luteum. The function of the corpus luteum is to mainly secrete progesterone. And what progesterone does is that it helps to maintain the thickness of the endometrium and thereby sustains the pregnancy. If the pregnancy occurs, then yes, the placenta will also develop, and around 3 months or so, the placenta will take over the secretion of progesterone from the corpus luteum. If no pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum will degenerate into the corpus albicans, which is simply scar tissue. Progesterone secretion will therefore fall dramatically, and that is actually the trigger for menstruation. Let's now discuss the hormonal regulation of estrogen. It's very similar to what we saw previously with testosterone. The gonadotropic releasing hormone, or GnRH, that is produced by the hypothalamus, travels down the hypophyseal portal tract to the anterior pituitary, thereby stimulating the release of luteinizing hormone, or LH, as well as follicular stimulating hormone, or FSH. LH and FSH travel through the bloodstream to the ovaries. LH stimulates the theca cells of the ovaries to release an androgen precursor. It's actually a precursor to testosterone. FSH stimulates the granulosa cells in the ovaries to convert this androgen precursor to testosterone, and then testosterone is ultimately converted to estradiol. That's how estrogen is released from the ovaries. Here's it schematically. GnRH is released from the hypothalamus, travels down the hypophyseal portal tract to the anterior pituitary, thereby triggering the release of LH and FSH. We've seen this diagram previously in terms of the hypothalamus pituitary testicular axis. Now it's the hypothalamus pituitary ovarian axis. LH and FSH will travel through the bloodstream to the ovaries, thereby triggering the release of estrogen. And ultimately, estrogen promotes the development of the follicle. We'll see that when we look at the diagram of the ovarian cycle. Estrogen also promotes the development of female secondary sexual characteristics, including the maturation and development of the breast, the broadening of the hips, the growth of the axillary and pubic hair. So here's it just in summary. GnRH released from the hypothalamus triggers the release of LH and FSH. LH and FSH promotes the growth of several follicles, and hormones are thereby released from the ovaries. When plasma estrogen levels rise, they ultimately inhibit the release of LH and FSH, that's negative feedback. In addition, inhibin from the granulosa cells also inhibits FSH release, but we're not going to focus upon that. When estrogen levels reach a high level just before mid-cycle, just before ovulation, instead of having a negative feedback effect on LH and FSH release, it switches. It's really odd, but it does switch from a negative feedback effect to a brief positive feedback effect. Essentially what that does is that it causes the stored LH and some FSH in the anterior pituitary to be suddenly released, resulting in a surge of LH that is the ultimate trigger for ovulation. Ultimately, estrogen then switches back to negative feedback, and the high levels of estrogen will cause LH and FSH levels to drop, and the cycle continues. Schematically, this is what the ovarian cycle looks like. We have two phases: the follicular phase, whereby the follicle is developing and maturing. At day 14 approximately, we have the follicle rupturing and ovulation occurring. This is when the follicle releases the secondary oocyte. And then we have the luteal phase, which is the development of the corpus luteum. And if pregnancy doesn't occur, which is what we assuming over here the corpus luteum will ultimately degenerate into the corpus albicans. Remember that the luteal phase is constant at 14 days. It's the follicular phase that varies. In terms of the hormones that are involved, we have LH and FSH being released from the anterior pituitary in response to GnRH. You can see how LH and FSH triggers the release of estrogen. Estrogen, remember, is ultimately released from the granulosa cell after modification of a precursor released from the theca cells, the androgen precursor. The FSH would ultimately stimulate the granulosa cells to convert testosterone to estradiol, and you can see the concentration of estrogen increases. Estrogen has mainly a negative feedback effect on the release of LH and FSH, but at some point you can see it switches from a negative feedback effect to a positive feedback effect. So estrogen levels over here, somewhere over here, will switch to a positive feedback effect that causes the surge in LH, which is ultimately what triggers ovulation. And then the switchback occurs to negative feedback. LH and FSH levels drop off along with estrogen levels. Progesterone levels, on the other hand, start rising, and that's because the corpus luteum starts forming during the luteal phase. Ultimately, if pregnancy doesn't occur, the corpus luteum degenerates and progesterone levels start falling off. That's ultimately the trigger for menstruation, but we'll look at the menstrual cycle in more detail before summarizing all of this. Let's now discuss the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is a series of cyclical changes in the endometrium in response to the fluctuating ovarian hormone levels. There are three phases: days 1 to 5, which is the menstrual phase, days 6 to 14, which is the proliferative phase, and days 15 to 28, which is the secretory phase. The menstrual phase, which is days 1 to 5, occurs during menstruation when the ovarian hormone levels are at their lowest concentration. At this stage, the gonadotropins, GnRH, start rising along with LH and FSH. By day 5, the growing ovarian follicles starts to produce more estrogen, leading to more growth of the ovarian follicles. The proliferative phase, which is days 6 to 14, occurs under rising estrogen concentration level, thereby prompting the enlargement of the spiral arteries in the endometrium and the overall growth of the endometrium. The normally thick, sticky cervical mucus plug now thins in response to the rising estrogen level, thereby allowing sperm passage through the cervical os. Ovulation then occurs at the end of this proliferative phase. That would be mid-cycle, around day 14. The secretory phase begins at day 15 and is constant at 14 days. So the secretory phase is days 15 to 28. It's constant, much like the luteal phase. During this phase, the endometrium prepares itself to receive the fertilized embryo for implantation. The endometrial glands, for example, start secreting various nutrients in order to sustain the embryo. In addition, the cervical mucus plug regenerates itself. Previously, remember, it had thinned out, and now it's going to thicken to prevent the further entry of sperm. If fertilization, however, does not occur, now the corpus luteum degenerates towards the end of the secretory phase. It forms the corpus albicans. Progesterone levels consequently start dropping because the corpus luteum is what secretes the progesterone. In response to a drop in serum progesterone concentration, the spiral arteries in the endometrium start to vasoconstrict, thereby cutting off the blood supply to the endometrial cells that have undergone hyperplasia. Now the endometrial cells begin to die and the endometrial glands start to regress. Overall, the thickened endometrial layer starts slogging off and is ultimately shed. That is the start of menstruation. Let's just get back to the effects of estrogen before we wrap up this chapter. So remember that estrogen promotes oogenesis and follicular growth during the ovarian cycle. It also promotes the growth of the ovary itself, that's a primary female sexual organ, as well as the secondary female sexual organs, including the uterus, the mammary glands, and so forth. Estrogen also promotes the development of secondary female sexual characteristics at puberty, including the growth and development of the breast, the increased deposition of fat in the breasts and the hips, the widening of the pelvis in anticipation of childbirth, and the growth of both axillary and pubic hair. Here's just a table that shows you the development of the secondary female sexual characteristic. We had seen this table previously when looking at the male secondary sexual characteristic. So once more, it's the deposition of fat, predominantly in the breasts and the hips, breast growth and development, broadening of the pelvis, and growth of axillary and pubic hair. Here's what the menstrual cycle looks like in schematic form. So it's a 28-day cycle Remember, it varies, but day 0 is the start of menstruation. Why did menstruation occur? And that's because the corpus luteum degenerates to the corpus albicans. There's a drop in the levels of serum progesterone. The spiral arteries in the endometrium constrict. The endometrial cells and glands start to die, and ultimately they are shed and slugged off. That's the start of menstruation. Now we have the rise of GnRH and LH and FSH and ultimately estrogen that promotes follicular growth and development. And then estrogen switches to a positive feedback effect. We're going back to the ovarian cycle over here to cause the surge of LH. The surge of LH triggers ovulation, releasing the secondary oocyte that will now travel through the uterine tubes, waiting for fertilization to occur. If fertilization doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum, which is now starting to secrete progesterone, remember, maintains the thickened endometrial layer. It thickens it further and also helps to maintain it. Progesterone is really a pregnancy hormone, so progesterone has to be there in order to maintain the thickened endometrial layer. But if no fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum degenerates to the corpus albicans, progesterone levels fall off, and that is the trigger for the start of menstruation. The cycle continues. That brings us to the end of today's lesson. In summary, we looked at the anatomy and the brief physiology of the male reproductive system. We also did the anatomy of the female reproductive system, and we spent quite a bit of time looking at the overall physiology of both the ovarian and menstrual cycles, so please focus upon that. That brings us to the end of this course. How sad, but I'm glad for you. I really want to thank you for an amazing semester and wish you best of luck on the final exam. Thanks everyone. Have a wonderful week. Bye.